The U.S. Federal Reserve Fed could soon be abolished. If you're unaware of this and you're investing in stocks, bonds, especially in the U.S., or just holding on to cash without any action, your assets may face one of two fates after 2025, either a gradual decline in value or a sudden loss. Why is this happening? While Trump and Musk publicly claim they're pushing for government reforms, their real agenda appears to be eliminating the Federal Reserve. Outwardly, they seem to disagree with Fed Chairman Powell, but behind the scenes, their goal is to erase the national debt. What does this actually mean? Hello, everyone. Years ago, the U.S. offered the world a deal. Store your gold in our national reserves and we'll provide you with U.S. dollars in exchange. You could use those dollars for transactions, and whenever you wanted your gold back, you could trade the dollars for it. This system, known as the gold standard, ensured that U.S. dollars were backed by gold. But then the U.S. suddenly abandoned the gold standard. Since then, while you can still use U.S. dollars for transactions, exchanging them for gold is no longer an option. Essentially, the U.S. began printing money and trading it for gold globally, leading countries to accumulate dollars instead of gold. The Federal Reserve kept lowering interest rates and printing more money, devaluing dollars held around the world. Then the U.S. announced that holding dollars would lead to depreciation and encouraged nations to lend their dollars in exchange for interest payments. This tactic forced the world to lend to the U.S. Today, the U.S. owes the world an astronomical amount, so much that they can't even cover the interest payments. Musk, who played a key role in Trump's rise to power, has proposed an unprecedented idea: shutting down the Federal Reserve. If the institution that issues U.S. dollars is dismantled, what happens to the dollar? Does it become worthless? And if it does, would the U.S. still need to repay its massive debts? It's like saying, even if I owe you a lot, the currency is now worthless, so repayment doesn't matter. Skeptical? Many find it hard to believe that the U.S. could erase the dollar's value, but Musk has suggested switching to Bitcoin in the future. If that happens, the money the world lent to the U.S. could become uncollectible. Is this really possible? In practice, the U.S. has been gradually reducing the dollar's importance. Just this year, 6 states have recognized gold as a legitimate form of currency. What does this mean? In the U.S., individual states sometimes wield more power than the federal government, which means states can choose to ignore federal decisions. These 6 states now allow their citizens to use gold for transactions alongside U.S. dollars. Globally, countries typically rely on their own currencies. For example, Japan uses yen, and South Korea uses won. No one carries gold to buy ramen in Japan. Paper money, after all, is cheap to produce, whereas gold is expensive to mine and refine. For convenience and cost efficiency, nations favor issuing paper currency. But if gold re-emerges as a standard currency, the global financial system could face drastic changes. Today, you can pay with Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies by simply scanning a QR code, a hallmark of technological progress and convenience. Yet if people in these 6 states are asked to revert to carrying gold to make purchases, what would that signify? Previously, I discussed gold as an alternative to the US dollar. When the dollar strengthens, gold tends to lose value, and vice versa. If gold becomes the preferred medium of exchange instead of the dollar, the Federal Reserve's authority could be undermined. Even Warren Buffett hesitates to recommend gold, fearing it could destabilize the dollar-based system. Now, with these states tying the dollar to gold and encouraging its use, could this indicate that even they sense the dollar is in trouble? Are they urging citizens to convert dollars into gold before the situation worsens? Recently, Trump softened his stance, saying he won't push Powell to resign. What does this imply? It could signal the largest financial scam in history, one that's remained legal for the past 4 years. Biden may have blocked Trump's covert plans during his term, but if Trump returns to power, these financial maneuvers could resurface. The savings that people have spent their lifetimes accumulating could vanish almost overnight. So, what can you do to avoid becoming a pawn or victim of this scheme, or even use it to advance yourself? Follow my channel and I'll provide more insights in future videos. Worried you won't act in time? Like this video to save it to your playlist so you can revisit it anytime. Now, what's Trump's plan? The US is short on funds, so they need to pull money from around the world. His strategy is an upgraded version of global wealth transfer. If successful, after 2025, wealth from the middle and lower classes worldwide will shift to the US. Here's the simple explanation. The US has borrowed money it can't repay, and now it expects you, the lender, to bear the burden. Why did the world lend money to the US in the first place? Imagine lending the US $1 million today. They'd invest $300,000 into their economy, but the remaining $700,000 would go towards subsidies for citizens, or worse, into the pockets of powerful elites. With tax revenues falling and spending soaring, the US can't pay you $50,000 in annual interest anymore. Instead, they borrow more money to cover it. This cycle continues as they borrow from others to pay you, and so on. In reality, it's like maxing out credit cards to pay off other credit cards, with compounding interest making the debt unmanageable. Recognizing this, lenders are starting to back away. To counteract this, the Fed has raised interest rates to attract lenders, but long-term US bonds still aren't selling. Why? Even if you offer a higher interest rate, lenders know the principal won't be used for profitable investments, making it a losing proposition. Short-term loans, however, remain appealing due to high interest. Even Warren Buffett only buys short-term US bonds these days. But here's the problem. As Trump has stated, short-term debts will soon come due, and finding new lenders won't be easy. Eventually, the US will resort to printing money, triggering inflation, and further devaluing the dollar. This creates a vicious cycle: fewer lenders, more printed money, and an increasingly worthless dollar. Trump's plan aims to eliminate the dollar's global role entirely, ensuring the US doesn't have to repay its debts. An extreme proposal suggests abolishing the Federal Reserve, Fed, and switching to Bitcoin as the primary currency instead of the US dollar. Is this even feasible? Although the Fed is the central bank of the United States, it's not a government-owned institution, but a private entity. This means Trump doesn't have the authority to remove the Fed chair, much like you can't fire the CEO of a company you don't fully own. The only alternative would be to force the institution into bankruptcy, but firing the leadership isn't an option. You may be surprised to learn that the US owes more to the Fed than to countries like Japan or China. Essentially, the Fed prints money and lends it to the US when funds run low, but this money must eventually be repaid. To make matters more complex, a large share of the taxes Americans pay goes right back to the Fed. In essence, this makes the Fed the de facto owner of the US economy. The hard-earned money of citizens ultimately transforms into interest payments sent to the Fed, which has the luxury of simply printing more money to collect those payments. So, who really controls the Fed? There are rumors that a secretive family with assets exceeding $50 trillion has significant influence over the Fed. To put it in perspective, the current US debt stands at around $36 trillion. Recently, reports surfaced about the death of an heir from this mysterious family in a mansion fire. What does this mean? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Historically, those who have tried to abolish the Fed haven't met favorable ends. President Lincoln's attempt to issue greenbacks and Kennedy's plan to tie the dollar to silver both ended tragically. These examples highlight the challenges of opposing the Fed. For more, you can explore historical reports on these cases. It's puzzling why many people assume that if the government borrows their money, repayment is guaranteed. US government bonds are considered the safest assets globally, but history has shown that defaults and bankruptcies are possible. While interest payments might continue, there's no certainty that the principal will be returned. This is the precarious position the US finds itself in today. While this situation could persist for some time, holding cash becomes increasingly risky when the government prints money or reduces interest rates, causing the dollar's value to erode rapidly. In other words, no investment is completely safe, but not investing at all is far riskier. Even if you avoid learning about investments, reality will force you to confront these challenges eventually. As noted, Elon Musk has suggested abolishing the Fed, signaling that he sees the current system as unsustainable. However, this drastic measure is likely a last resort. Trump has already devised an updated strategy to compel the world to continue lending money to the US to sustain its debt. What does this strategy involve? Debt Strategy 1.0 emerged during wartime, when the US stayed out of conflicts and profited by selling weapons. After the war, the US capitalized on cheap opportunities to grow wealth, while much of the world remained impoverished. At that time, the US presented itself as a lender to help rebuild nations. "You need money and resources," they said. "Borrow our dollars to build homes, factories, and infrastructure. In return, you'll pay interest." This approach made the US the world's leading creditor. People around the globe became indirect workers for the US, funneling parts of their income into interest payments. It's comparable to owning a home but spending your paycheck paying interest to the bank. However, as global economies recovered, demand for US loans declined. Infrastructure and factories had already been built, and nations became less reliant on American money. Meanwhile, Americans had grown accustomed to a lifestyle funded by global wealth. They worked less, instead relying on international dollars for consumption and luxury. As profits from lending declined and spending rose, the US needed a new strategy. Debt Strategy 2.0. Under this version, the US expanded its balance sheet, printing more money and increasing the risk of dollar depreciation. To counteract this, nations were essentially forced to lend dollars back to the US in exchange for interest payments. Initially, this strategy involved reinvesting borrowed money into profitable ventures. However, much of it ended up in the hands of powerful corporations, leaving even the interest payments unaffordable. This led to Debt Strategy 3.0, essentially taxing global partners. Why does the world earn so many US dollars? Countries sell goods to the US, receiving dollars in return. But now, the US demands a portion of those earnings back. For example, if you earn $1 million selling to the US, you may need to return $300,000 in tariffs or taxes. Refuse, and the US may cut off trade or impose sanctions. This approach forces compliance, often at a greater cost to foreign nations. It's taxation disguised as economic policy, reinforced by military pressure. Trump and his financial advisors aim to divide nations into three categories. The first group, the blue bucket, comprises allies willing to cooperate closely with the US. The second, the yellow bucket, includes neutral countries that engage in trade, but also pursue independent policies. The third, the red bucket, contains adversaries attempting to exploit US resources or technology. A nation's classification determines its treatment, from favorable agreements to punitive measures. For instance, Japan signed the Plaza Accord, agreeing to reduce tariffs and sell dollars to buy yen. This caused the yen's value to rise against the dollar, doubling the cost of Japanese goods while making American products cheaper. This shift led to Japanese consumers favoring imports from the US, and Japanese capital flowed into American stocks and real estate. Meanwhile, the US drained wealth from Japan, leaving its businesses struggling and its economy in decline. A similar pattern has played out in Hong Kong in recent years. Historically, Japan was wealthy enough to purchase American landmarks like the Rockefeller Center, Columbia Pictures, and Universal Studios. But when Japan's assets became overvalued and foreign capital fled, the economy collapsed. Real estate bubbles burst, jobs were lost, and bankruptcy became widespread. At its peak, Japan's suicide rate was among the highest globally. The cycle is clear. As nations struggle, American capitalists move in to acquire assets at bargain prices. For countries in the red bucket, US tariffs and sanctions could devastate their economies. Currency devaluation often follows, as nations attempt to keep exports competitive. However, this comes at a cost. Imported goods become more expensive, worsening economic conditions. Imagine starting a high-tech company in Vietnam, only to face US sanctions because the factory is located outside America. To avoid penalties, you might relocate the company to the US, gaining tax breaks and subsidies. This results in a brain drain, leaving nations like Vietnam with rising unemployment and declining industries. The wealth ultimately flows back to the US, whether quickly or gradually. If your nation is in the blue bucket, your currency might appreciate. But if you're in the red bucket, depreciation is almost certain. Countries once in the blue bucket, like Japan, Germany, and the UK, have seen their currencies gain value due to agreements like the Plaza Accord. Investing in these currencies could serve as a hedge against dollar devaluation. Personally, I've exchanged some of my dollars for Japanese yen as a safeguard. When Trump's policies take effect, or if the US cuts interest rates while Japan raises them, the yen may appreciate significantly. Thinking long-term, which nations might end up in the red bucket? Could this create opportunities to acquire undervalued assets? Share your thoughts below. I'm here to provide insights on wealth building, entrepreneurship, and financial freedom. If you found value in this content, follow my channel, turn on notifications, and share this video. If even one point today helps improve your financial outlook, that's a win for both of us.